Before we talk about what poetry is, think about your experiences with poetry in school. What poems did you memorize in class? How many haiku did you have to write? Did you enjoy it? Did you understand what you were doing? Poetry is an expression through meaning, sound, and rhythmic language that is meant to evoke an emotional response. Poetry has been known to employ meter and rhyme, but this is by no means necessary. Poetry is an ancient format that has gone through numerous and drastic reinventions over time. The very nature of poetry as an authentic and individual mode of expression makes it nearly impossible to define. Poetry can be cross-curricular. Encyclopedia by Douglas Florian is a collection of poems connecting us with biology. Brian Cleary has a series of poetry books about parts of speech.
What determines if poetry is well written? The answer ultimately lies with the reader of the poem, but there is a certain consensus as to what makes a poem good or bad. Poetry demands precision. The novelist can get away with less than precise expression from time to time because the story will pull the reader along. The job of the poet is to create a picture in the mind and emotion in the heart. Every single word counts. A wrong choice, such as a word with the wrong connotation, or the wrong number of syllables, or an unlovely combination of consonant sounds will spoil it all. The underlying thought of the poem is also important. Some poems are written to create a picture only, but the most memorable poems also convey a universal truth about the human condition.
So let's talk about the different forms that we can find in poetry. We have narrative poems. An example of this would be Dr. Seuss's Hooray for Diff'n'Doofr Day.
Another form of poetry is lyric poems. Lyric poetry is melodic or song-like. An example would be Rain, Rain, Go Away. Rain, rain, go away, come again another day, little Johnny wants to play.
Another form of poetry is limericks. Limericks are humorous poems. One example would be Granny Gooding, and that is written by Jack Prelutsky in the book called The Frogs Wore Red Suspenders. Granny Gooding. Granny Gooding lost her footing, fell into a pudding vat. There was pudding on her jacket, pudding, pudding in her hat. There was pudding in her slippers, pudding, pudding on her dress. Ever since she lost her footing, Granny Gooding's been a mess.
Another form that poetry can take is haiku. Our book gives an example by David McCord. Take the butterfly. Nature works to produce him. Why doesn't he last?
Another form of poetry is concrete poems. They are written or printed on the page in a shape representing the poem's subject. So an example of that would be in our textbook on page 98. It is in the shape of a flamingo, and it goes, "A flamingo is a long, cool drink of something pink." And then another example would be in the book Mama Lobelia, and it's called The Lemurs. And it goes, "In Madagascar, leaping lemurs breeze through trees without breaking femurs."
Free verse is another form of poetry. Free verse poems are mostly unrhymed and lack a consistent rhythm. One example of this is in our book on page 94, and it is called Stockings from At Christmas Time. It is by Valerie Worth. Long ago, we hung up my mother's old nylons and woke to find them swollen with beige, unnatural bulges thigh to toe. Nowadays, there are velvety crimson boots, brighter and shapelier, but a lot shorter.
There are some additional forms that poetry can take that are kind of a miscellaneous category. One example I found was If You Were a Chocolate Mustache by J. Patrick Lewis, and it's called Ha Ha Homonym. Sunny, sunny, a minor, minor, in a hole, hole, dug o'er, a few, seems, it seems, with hose and hose to load the load. Then shoot the chute and one, metal, metal, here, here.
Why is poetry important? Poetry helps us know each other and build community. When read aloud, poetry is rhythm and music, sounds and beats. Young children may not always understand all the words or meaning, but they'll feel the rhythms and get curious about what the sounds mean and perhaps even want to create their own. Poetry also opens venues for speaking and listening. Poetry has a space for English language learners because poems defy rules. They can be easily scaffolded and students can find ways of expressing their voices while being limited in their vocabulary. Poetry builds resilience in children and adults. It fosters social and emotional learning. A well-crafted phrase or two in a poem can help us see an experience in an entirely new way. Lastly, I want to cover the importance of building a poetry collection. A poetry collection should include poems that meet the needs of children who are in the process of developing an appreciation of poetry. This means building a collection filled with a variety of poems to match different tastes and levels of sophistication. This would include light and humorous verses, poems that create vivid images and express hard to communicate feelings, also story poems and poetry that plays with the sounds of language.